I'm an urban wildlife biologist with Texas Parks and Wildlife, and I'm going to talk with you all about nuisance rookeries, talk a little bit about what they are, the laws and regulations surrounding them, and most importantly, what you can do to stop these birds from becoming established on your property. So, if you're here tonight, you know what a rookery is. A rookery is basically nesting or roosting birds that are in trees. In this case, we're referring to colonial nesting water birds. And it can vary in size from just a few nesting pairs of birds to thousands of birds. And these birds generally prefer forested, wooded areas with tall, mature trees with dense canopy cover. And that's really kind of the key. They really like that dense canopy cover because it helps them feel sheltered from elements or predators, and also overlapping branches help them to kind of move from tree to tree. So that's a big preference that these birds have. These birds exhibit site fidelity, which means that they return to the same location year after year. And some communities that I've worked with in the past, they've kind of had, I've had residents tell me like, well, we always had like a few birds in this area, and then one year they just exploded. And so that's something that can happen too, is sometimes you might have a few species in small numbers, and then for whatever reason, more individuals are attracted to an area. And it's important to keep that site fidelity issue in mind, because what that means is this is not just going to be a one and done type thing. It's going to be a continuing issue for several years, unfortunately. Nesting season can begin in February and can end in October. There are different species, and we'll talk about the different species in this on the next slide, but there are different species that are typically found in the nuisance rookery in our area, and they arrive at different times, they leave at different times, and they'll start laying eggs at different times. So you'll kind of have waves of nesting. You may also have birds that lose a nest early in the season and then relay later. So in a rookery, you'll have nests in different stages of development. And why do they do this? Well, it's a survival strategy. The idea of if we all get together and have our babies at one time, then it's basically known as predator swamping, which is there's so many of us in one place that the predators can't possibly get us all. They're going to be overwhelmed. And so it can kind of be a cool thing to see if it's not in your yard, right? Because the reality is hundreds of birds in one place, there's going to be a lot of poop. It's going to be noisy. It's going to smell. You're going to have dead birds, injured birds, some birds just hanging out on the ground because they can, prey remnants on the ground, all sorts of stuff that you don't want to have to deal with. So these are the species that are the most common in our area when we're talking about nuisance rookeries. So these two species over here, the black crowned night heron and the yellow crowned night heron, those are typically not very high in numbers, but they're the ones that show up first. So these are the guys that are most likely showing up now. They can start nesting in February. And like I said, these species, typically they're not in huge numbers. They're not as abundant as, say, the cattle egret is. And so a lot of times people might not notice these birds, or they might see them and think, hey, that's a cool bird that's made a nest in my tree. And they don't realize until a couple months down the road that they have a problem when more birds show up. So there's also the great egret and the snowy egret, the little blue heron, and the cattle egret. So the cattle egret is almost always the most abundant bird in a nuisance rookery, and they typically show up in like late April. So the key really is to look for these guys, because they'll show up, maybe lay their eggs in March, and then the cattle egret shows up, and most people don't really realize that they have a problem until the cattle egrets kind of show up in full force. But at that point, because those eggs have already been laid, you're already limited in what you can do in terms of response. So we want to know how to manage these birds, so we have to consider what laws and regulations are out there. So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is a federal law. It's one of the oldest wildlife protection laws that we have. And also that word treaty is important because it is an international agreement between the U.S., Canada, Mexico, Japan, and Russia. And the reason why it's an international agreement is because birds don't recognize political boundaries. And the idea there is that, you know, if Canada is doing everything that they can to protect their nesting habitat for birds, and then they migrate to the U.S. for the winter and we just shoot them all, like, it's going to undermine whatever Canada is doing. So that's why it's an international agreement. This is one of the strongest wildlife protection laws on the books, and basically it makes it illegal to take or possess any migratory birds, their eggs, their feathers, or their nests. So you can't injure birds, you can't possess parts of birds, you can't kill birds, and violations of this can result in fines and jail time. And then there is also a state code in Texas that it basically says all the same stuff as the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. It doesn't, not quite as intense as the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, but it functionally means the same thing when we're talking about managing egrets. So what does this mean? It is prohibited to kill or injure the birds or harass them in a way that causes the abandonment of death of eggs or hatchlings. So there's some wiggle room there, right? You can harass adult birds as long as you're not hurting them or killing them, and there's not an egg or a hatchling that might be abandoned as a result of the actions. So what that means is it is legal to use scare tactics up until the moment that the first nest in that rookery has an egg laid in it. So once the first bird lays an egg, all harassment and scare tactics have to stop. And we'll talk more later on about what acceptable harassment and scare tactic techniques are. However, it's important to note that routine neighborhood activities can continue. So your day-to-day business, you know, mowing your yard, trash collection, backing out of your driveway, all that stuff can still happen. The birds made their nest in this location with all of that stuff going on, so it shouldn't present a significant disturbance to the birds. At the end of nesting season, when birds start to leave, you can go in and nests can be removed at that point without any special permits or anything like that. So you can remove nests, and you want to remove that old nesting material from the previous year because it can be a draw for birds in subsequent years. And you can also dispose of any infertile eggs or dead nestlings at that time. And you can pick them up, well, the city can pick them up throughout the year too. So usually people want to know, is there some sort of permit that we can get to get an exception for this? There is a federal depredation permit that authorizes the lethal removal of a limited number of birds and eggs. Now, the key word there is limited. So this is not going to be like a magic wand that you get this permit and then your problem is solved, because it really is a limited amount of takes. So they may authorize up to 10% take of the total number of the birds in the rookery, and that's also going to include eggs. So under the law, a bird and an egg are going to be counted as the same in terms of take. And you know, if you have 400 birds, removing 40 is not really going to fix your problem, right? We do generally recommend, though, that cities, if possible, go ahead and apply for a federal depredation permit, though, because it can give you a little bit more wiggle room when it comes to managing the birds in some situations, even if you're not really intending to use it for targeted lethal removal. So, how do we prevent these? Early detection is absolutely key. You want to focus on the sentry or the scout birds, those birds that are showing up now. The birds that show up first tend to be more nervous. They don't feel like they have that safety in numbers feeling, and they are more likely to leave because they're still kind of scoping the area out and trying to decide if it's a good place to make their nest or not. So they're more likely to be deterred early on. And it's also important to act before eggs are laid. It's important that people know what's going on. This is what we're here doing tonight, right? We've kind of talked about some ways that this can, usually people don't know about this issue, unfortunately, until they've had to deal with it. And then also develop a plan. So if you know that your community is likely to deal with this issue, have a response plan in place. So, scare tactics. There are noise deterrents and visual deterrents. Noise deterrents are basically things that make loud noises and sound scary. So these can be things like predator calls, firecrackers, propane cannons, things that make loud noises, scare the birds. They don't want to hang around that. You can also do visual deterrents. These are things like mylar tape and scare eye balloons. Basically, these are, so the scare eye balloon is that yellow and red balloon at the bottom there. These are things that you hang in the tree, and they shine, they move, birds don't like it. With these, if you're going to use these, get them as high up in the tree as possible. A lot of times you see people who go outside, and I get it because I don't have a huge ladder, right? But people will go and they'll just hang it on like the first limb of their tree that they can reach, right? And that's not going to be very effective if the birds are nesting at the top of your trees. You want it up where the birds are going to be and where they're going to see it. You can even go as far as knocking out early nesting material from the trees, as long as there are no active nests in the colony, so no eggs have been laid. You can go out there and knock those nests out of the trees if you see them starting to put sticks together. You just need to be sure that before you do that, be very, very certain that there is no egg in that nest. Habitat modification. So this is really the key, okay? If you don't want birds, these birds in your yard, habitat modification is the key. Anytime we're trying to manage wildlife, either to attract wildlife or to get wildlife away, modifying the habitat is really going to be the key. So we talked about how these birds really like dense canopy cover, and when they don't have that dense canopy cover, so they prefer greater than 75% canopy closure. So if you thin your tree canopies below that threshold, it makes the habitat much less appealing to them, and hopefully they won't perceive it as a suitable habitat. But if they do still show up and still try to nest, they'll be much more uncomfortable and much more likely to be scared off by your deterrent efforts. And so this is kind of a before and after from two different sides of the street. Here's another example. So we are not asking you to cut your trees down. You will still have trees, but what you want is you want to be able to look up and see the sky, sunshine down on the ground, and you're trying to get rid of those overlapping branches. And so that's important too, is when we say, remove 25% of the canopy or something like that, don't just take it all from the bottom. It needs to be throughout the tree. So, you don't have that dense cover at the top of the tree. So this is the most effective control method, and the benefit of it too is it's going to provide longer lasting protection than going out and shooting off a firecracker or a propane cannon, right? Like, we've all seen grackles in parking lots before with like the trucks driving around making T-Rex noises or shooting things off. And the birds will go and then 10 minutes later they're back. Kind of the same with the egrets. It does make them uncomfortable, and noise deterrents are one tool to have in the toolbox, but if they don't like the habitat, if they come back and they're kind of like, wow, this neighborhood has really gone downhill from last year, it makes them not want to hang out in that area. So this is really the most important thing. So if you have not yet gotten your trees trimmed, I really recommend that you do that. And tell your neighbors to do it too. So a combination of these deterrent techniques is typically going to be the most effective. So starting now, so be on the lookout for birds. If you see birds, go ahead and start with those deterrents and keep them up through potentially June, basically until you stop seeing the birds coming and scoping out the neighborhood. So really, again, just want to stress, prevention is key, because once that first egg has been laid, you're really limited in your response and what you can do until the birds leave. And this will be something that unfortunately you'll have to look out for year to year, but it's not an impossible thing to prevent. I've seen a lot of communities come together to deal with this issue and successfully prevent the birds from returning. So it absolutely can be done.